Welcome back, everybody. This is the third installment in a series of explanation videos, which are intended to give you some guidelines and directions for just how to complete assignments, where to find resources you need, and how you will be evaluated on those assignments. In this video, I'm going to focus on the response paper assignments. So, just as a first word, if you want to look further into anything I'm going to talk about here, if you want to see the document that I'm using right now, it is posted on Blackboard, and if you open up that document, you'll notice that there's a table of contents, and you'll also notice that it's linked. So if there's anything you want to read further on and look back at again, simply go to the table of contents. Let's say you want to know more about how to do citation. Click there. It'll immediately take you to the spot you're looking for. So just a helpful note there. Okay, so first, I want to say a few things about what the purpose of the assignment is and what the basic requirements of the response paper assignment are. The purpose of the assignment is to give you practice in developing the skills necessary to read philosophical writing and criticize arguments. So, in a sense, this is one of the most fundamental skills that you should get out of a course in the Introduction to Philosophy. And the purpose of this assignment is to give you the chance to do that over an extended period of time over the course of the semester. And I'm going to get more into this in a little bit, but essentially what the assignment will do will give you a prompt. It'll say, here's a stretch of text. First, explain the argument contained in that stretch of text, and then engage in some sort of philosophical analysis of that stretch of text. Usually that is going to involve criticize the argument, namely, you've explained the argument, now explain why you think that argument is incorrect, or here's a problem with it. It could take other forms, but that will always be explained in the prompt. But in general, that is the general sort of purpose of the assignment. Let's talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts requirements. So first, how many papers are you required to do? If you look at the syllabus, you will notice that there are 10 different spots on the course schedule where it mentions a response paper. So you'll see response paper 1 all the way through response paper 10. However, you are not required to complete 10 response papers. You're actually only required to complete 4. It's just up to you to choose which ones you're going to do. So the idea here was I wanted to give you the opportunity to choose which response papers fit best, but your schedule will give you that flexibility. However, there is one caveat here. So the first 5 response paper assignments are all included up to October 9th, right? So from the very beginning of the course to October 9th, that's all the way up to the first exam, there are 5 response paper opportunities. You must complete at least 2 of those response papers. Now, if you want, you could just do response papers 1 through 4 and be totally done. That would be fine. But this requirement just makes sure that you do at least 2 in the first half of the class. And here the point really is a very practical one. I find that if I don't require students to space out the response papers, there's a tendency to procrastinate, save them all for the end of the semester when you'll be busy with many other things. So to prevent you from doing that, you must complete at least 2 of the response papers in the first half of the course. You can do more if you want, but you can't do any less than 2. If you complete less than 2 response papers in the first half of the course, let's say you only completed 1, that would unfortunately mean you would be taking a 0 on one of the required 4 papers. So you want to make sure you get at least 2 done in the first half of the course. Now, it's also asked of me often, well, since there's 10 opportunities and we're required to do 4, can I submit more than 4 papers if I want, and and drop the lowest grade, depending on how many I do? My answer here is no, right? But I will say this. Although you're not allowed to do any more than 4 response papers, every time you do a response paper, it will count as one of your grades. One of the things I take into account at the end of the semester when I'm adjusting your borderline grades is your progress in the response paper assignments. So again, remember, these are intended to be practice, help you develop the skills in philosophical writing and criticizing philosophical arguments. And these are skills that probably, given that this is an introduction to philosophy class, are probably foreign to you at this point. And so it's totally natural to expect that the quality of your work on the first response paper will not be as good as the quality of your work on the last one. So if I see real improvement, if you're taking my feedback, and we'll get back to feedback later, but if you're taking my feedback, making real improvements, and I see that you've generally gotten better over the course of the semester, then I would be willing to bump up your overall grade at the end to take that into account. So the real main thing to say about this is that if the grade you get in your first response paper isn't where you want it to be, don't get too worried about it. Really just focus on improving with my feedback after that first paper, and know that that will give you the opportunity to bump up your grade in the course in the end. Okay. Other nuts and bolts sort of things, due dates. Each response paper has its own due date. You can look at the course schedule on the syllabus and see this. Another area that you can see this is in section 5 of this document. I have a description of each response paper assignment. So there's 10 possibilities. Each has its own set of prompts. And so let's just go to response paper 1, for instance. Here's the prompt for response paper 1. Right, this is what you would be writing about. It also lists the due date here. So response paper 1 is due Friday, September 4th at 11:59 p.m. Central Standard Time. And all these response papers are always going to be due on the Friday of the week in which they're occurring. So for instance, response paper 2 is due Friday, September 18th, etc., etc. And you'll turn these in on Blackboard. So you should turn in a Word document. I will accept PDF, but just so you know, Word documents are a little better because if you want my feedback on your paper, it's easier for me to just make comments directly on a Word document, and then when I send it back to you, it'll be easier for you to view those comments. But either would be acceptable. So they're always due on Friday, and you can see the date and time due on the syllabus or in the specific description of that response paper assignment. Okay, so in terms of basic requirements, let's talk a little bit about the assignment length and format. So first of all, the overall length requirement for the paper is 600 words. And what is included in that 600 words? All the real written content, right? So not title, not your name, not the things in the bibliography section, not the section headings. That's the stuff that's actually written, the written content of the paper. Now, in addition to that, there's more specific requirements regarding length. And to explain this, I want to say a little bit about the format of the paper. So here you see I have an example, right? That your it is a requirement that your paper is divided into these section headings: explanation, analysis, and bibliography. And in fact, if I was to write this assignment, the very first thing I would do, and I'll just show you an example. So let's say I was going to write a response paper. Maybe first I would give it a nifty title. This isn't really like that important. You don't necessarily need a title, but you might as well. So let's say I was writing on Plato's Euthyphro, and I'll call this paper "For the Love of God." What is the nature of piety? Okay, so there's my title. Maybe I want to, obviously you should put my name on it as well. So Ryan Pollock. Okay, so once you have that out of the way, in terms of the formatting that you need to have, the next thing you should do is I would allow a space for your explanation section. I would put 1, explanation, 2, analysis, 3, bibliography. That is the very first thing I would do before you start writing at all in terms of setting up your paper. And the reason why I require section headings, it just really makes it a lot easier for me to grade. So if I know exactly where the explanation portion of the paper is, where the analysis portion is, I can separate it out much more easily, and it just makes the grading a lot easier on my part. So that is one of the basic requirements in terms of formatting. Okay, so like I said, the entire paper must be at least 600 words, but also we break that down in terms of the sections. So in your explanation section, this section needs to have at least 200 words, and your analysis has to have at least 200 words. So that could mean, they don't have to be the same, right? Your explanation could be 200, your analysis could be 400, vice versa. That's fine. Just each of them needs to be at least 200 words. And the reason I have this is I want to make sure you're not, for instance, using 590 words to explain the argument and then doing your analysis section in one sentence. I want them to be, somewhat equal, some parity in length between them. Okay, now we're going to go through what I expect out of each of these sections in a little more detail, but I'll give you just a general, sort of outline of what they're for. As you might guess, the explanation section is where you'll be explaining the argument from the reading that's identified in the prompt. So here you're not giving your evaluation of it, you're not criticizing the argument, you're just saying, here's what is said in the reading, here's how the author is arguing. Then in your analysis section, as directed by the prompt, you will engage in criticism or philosophical analysis of the argument. So here's where you say, well, I think this argument has a problem. You'll explain what that problem is. In the bibliography section, you'll just list all the sources that are used. And this brings up another point, right? So in terms of the bibliography, there's only one source you're required to use. And that source is whatever the reading is you're going to be writing on. So for instance, in this paper that I was imagining I'm writing it on Plato's Euthyphro. And because that's the case, I need to have a citation in my bibliography section to that source. So you might say, well, how do I know that the citation information for the sources? All of our readings are online. They're not coming from the same place that I know what the citation information is for. Excellent question. Luckily for you, I've provided all the bibliographic information. So after you have formatted your paper properly, next thing I would do, I would go right to the bibliography section of this document, and you'll notice that I have the bibliographic information for all the readings in this course that you could write on. So I said the one I'm writing on is Plato, Euthyphro. So you can go ahead, copy, paste that in the bibliography, and there we go. Right. So now I have the correct citation information in my bibliography. Now, you might ask about other sources. Are you required or can you use other sources in your paper? You can use other sources in your paper if you wish, but you're not required to. I'll have a few more things to say about what sources are appropriate, but for now I'll just say that the only thing you have to cite is whatever reading you're writing about. You can use other sources if you want, but it is not required. Okay, so let's say a few things about the actual content of the paper and what I'll be looking for. So I already said that the explanation section of the paper is where you will be explaining the argument that's identified in the reading. All right, now, so let's just take a look at, to get a better idea of this, let's take a look at one specific response paper assignment in particular. So below I have the prompts from response paper 2. All right, so the first thing you need to do is decide which prompt you'll actually be writing about. Now, some response paper assignments will have just one prompt, and other response paper assignments will have more than one. This one has more than one. We have essay prompt 1 and essay prompt 2. So what does that mean? You just choose one of them, and only one of them. Do not try to write about both, just write about one of the prompts. Now, if there's only one prompt, of course, then you don't have a choice, you just write about that one. Okay, so in this case, let's just take a look at essay prompt 1. It says, Socrates' cross-examination of Meletus begins at 24c. Socrates tells us that this is the goal of his cross-examination, and Socrates argues for this on these pages. So what the explanation portion of your assignment is going to require you to do is to explain the argument that Socrates is giving on those pages. Now, one thing you'll often see in these prompts is that I provided some questions for you to help you accomplish this task, to help you explain the argument. So, for instance, it says, in your explanation section, explain the argument Socrates makes. What does Socrates ask Meletus to identify? I should say, why does Socrates ask Meletus to identify who is responsible for improving the youth? What point does Socrates make with the horse breeding analogy? How does Socrates establish that if he corrupts the youth, that is doing so is unintentional, etc.? So there's a number of questions here. Now, what should you think about these questions? It's not the case that you have to answer every single one of those questions. You might or you might not. But the point is, I've just given you some guidance, some questions to think about that'll help you get going when you try to explain the argument. These questions are meant to help you identify what are the main points that the author is really trying to hit. Okay, so in all the prompts, there will be some questions like that specific to that reading to help you get at the main point. But I also want to make some more general comments about what I'm looking for in the explanation section. And in general, what I would say is that whenever you are explaining a philosopher's argument, you want to try to do it in as clear and a detailed fashion as possible that shows me you absolutely understand the argument that is being made. And to help you out, there are really whenever you're explaining a philosophical argument, there are really three questions you should keep in mind. Now, the first thing I'll say is, I'm going to use some terminology that assumes you already have knowledge of the points I made about logic and the structure of argument. So if you haven't watched the video on logic and structure of argument, you should probably pause this right now, go back and watch that first. Okay, so whenever you're trying to explain a philosophical argument, here are the three questions you want to keep in mind. Question 1, what is the conclusion of the argument? What position is the author arguing for? So, one sentence that if you have it in your explanation section lets me know that at least you're on the right track in terms of your orientation would be something like this. Now, of course, it doesn't have to be exactly this sentence. It doesn't even have to be the first sentence of your explanation. But somewhere you would want to say something like, let's get off of bold here. In this selection, Socrates, or whoever the author is, argues that, and then fill in the blank. One of the things you want to make clear to your reader from the very outset is, here is the conclusion that the author or the philosopher is arguing for. Here's what they're trying to show is true. Now, it may not be the case that this would be the first sentence. Particularly in this case, it's talking about Socrates' cross-examination of Meletus in the Apology. And so the reader would have to know something about the context of the trial and what was going on. But somewhere early on, before you get to explain the argument, you should make clear to the reader what the end point is. What is the conclusion this person is trying to argue for? Right? And so this is one thing to keep in mind. What is the end point? What is the conclusion? Okay, now once you've identified that conclusion and explained it in clear and precise detail, the next question you should ask is, what are the premises of the argument? What are the major reasons that the author uses to demonstrate that the conclusion of the argument is true? So you say, here's the author's conclusion, this is what they're attempting to argue for. What are the major reasons they're giving? What is the evidence they're giving for why this position is true? So in a philosophical argument, you have your conclusion and the premises, however many, major big reasons for why they believe this conclusion is correct. And this leads to the third question. The next thing you would want to explain is, how does the author argue that these premises are true? What reason do they give us to think that the first premise, the second premise, the third premise, as you've identified it, is actually the case? And sometimes I'll refer to these as justifications. So you identify what the first premise is. What's the justification for premise 1? You identify the second premise. What's the reason to believe that's true? So this is the basic structure you want to keep in mind. What's the conclusion? What are the major reasons given? How do they justify each of those premises? Now, one important thing to say here, this will all seem a bit abstract until you just get into the nitty-gritty of looking at the readings. And of course, you'll also get more used to this if you really pay attention to the lessons, you watch the videos. You'll just get more used to thinking in this philosophical fashion. But one thing I'll say is this. When you're thinking about how does the author justify the premises, explain why the premises are true, some premises are going to be worth more attention than others. In some cases, some premises of arguments are relatively obvious. Almost anyone would agree with them. And if that's the case, you don't really need to spend much time at all explaining why the author thinks it's true. It's just a widely accepted claim. But other premises will be very controversial. They would produce wide disagreement. And it's likely, if that's the case, that's probably one of the premises you're going to want to attack in your analysis section. And it's also the premise you're going to want to spend the most time explaining why that author thinks it's true. If the premise is controversial, if it's one a lot of people would disagree with, it would also need the largest amount of justification or the largest amount of discussion of why the author thinks it's correct. So that's just to say that in your explanation section, focus on the structure of the argument, what are the premises, what's the conclusion, and then justifying the most controversial premises. All right. Now, to wrap up, here's really the ultimate goal. I say what you're trying to do in the explanation section is give what I would call a complete explanation of the argument you're writing about. How do I define this? Completely explaining a philosophical argument means explaining everything an intelligent person who's unacquainted with philosophy, this class, or the argument you're writing about would need to fully understand that argument. So imagine you're trying to explain this argument to an intelligent roommate, but an intelligent roommate who has never taken any philosophy or has no idea what you're talking about. What that means is you shouldn't think of me as your audience because I already know the argument. But think about the detail and the clarity you would need to explain to someone what is going on in this argument, even if they had never been in this class. That should be your goal. Because if you couldn't do that, if you can accomplish that, and explain it in those sorts of clear terms, then I know you must understand the argument as well. So that's what I'm looking for there. So then we get to the analysis section. And notice in this prompt in particular it says, then in your analysis section, criticize the argument that Socrates makes here. Now I want to make a few comments on this. Usually the analysis section will require you to criticize the argument, but you might say, well, why is that the case? What if I agree with the argument? That's fine, right? I don't assume that anything you put down on paper in your response paper is necessarily has to be a reflection of your actual beliefs. Remember, what we're doing here is a sort of intellectual exercise. I'm trying to get you used to criticizing philosophical arguments, and no matter what you think about the argument itself, you'll always be pushed more if you're forced to disagree with it. If you write a paper just saying how great the argument already is, that doesn't necessarily force you to think critically about it. So by requiring you to criticize it, I'm trying to force you to think critically, really think about the structure of the argument. The second thing I want to say about this is you'll hopefully get more used to philosophical criticism as we go throughout the course. So I won't say a ton about sort of how to do it. I think you just have to learn by doing, trying, and failing, and trying again. But in your analysis section, there is, again, one sentence, which if you have this sentence, I really know you've got the right orientation. And again, it doesn't have to be this exact sentence, but somewhere in your analysis section, if you say, get off bold once again, the premise of this argument I reject is fill in the blank. Or you could say, I disagree with the following premise, right? The point is, if you have some sentence in your analysis section that is identifying which premise of the argument you reject, then I know you're on the right track. Because there's a reason we outline philosophical arguments and understand them in this structure. It's because once we have a clear outline of the reasons that lead to the final conclusion, then we can say, okay, you know what? Premise 1 seems pretty iffy. I think that's the one I want to reject. And to do that, then I have to say, here's why this justification for premise 1 is false. What I'm really looking for in the analysis section is that you have a laser focus. You say, I'm going to reject this premise, and then I'm going to explain why, in as much detail as I can, why I think this premise is incorrect. And it's not that you can't write about multiple premises, but I would caution you against doing so. The reasons for this are a couple. First, it's a relatively short assignment, only 600 words is required. And so what I'm really looking for is depth of analysis. It's always better to cover a smaller number of points in more detail than a larger number of points in less detail, in just a more general way. Okay, so again, hopefully you'll get more used to philosophical analysis and criticism as we go throughout the class, but those are some of the guidelines I would give. So next, let's talk a little bit about citation. So first, you should always, this paper requires you to use in-text citation. And so the format you would use would be the following. Right, for any source which has page numbers, you would use the author's last name and then the page number. So let's say I was saying, Socrates claims that, let's see, the love of the gods does not define piety, right? So this is a claim that Socrates makes, and we'll get to this in a second. It's not a direct quote, right? This isn't a direct quote from the text. I'm just saying that this is a thing Socrates thinks. And because that is the case, in parentheses, I would have to put the author of the specific text. In this case, it would actually be Plato. Socrates is a character in the dialogue. So it would be Plato, and I don't remember off the top of my head what page this occurs on, but then you would put, let's say, page 11. So here I've told you, I'm saying Socrates claims that the love of gods doesn't define what piety means. What's the evidence that Socrates says this? Well, go ahead and look for yourself. It's on page 11 of the reading by Plato. And so you will have to do that. The important point here is you will have to do that every single time you say that an author claims something, believes something, states something. Because if you are attributing some claim to an author, if you're saying they argue this point, they believe this point is true, they say this thing, then there must be some page where it's said, and you need to cite that page. And notice, when you do this, you're paraphrasing. Because in this particular assignment, direct quotation is not permitted. So that means at no point should I see something like this. Socrates states that, quote, the unexamined life is not worth living. So this actually would be a quote. Again, I don't know the exact page on the Apology where it comes from, but we'll just fill one in, 15. Okay, so the point is, this is not something you should do. At no point should you have any direct quotations, because again, the assignment is relatively short. I don't want you taking up much time with direct quotation. So every sort of citation should be a paraphrase. You should be putting the author's words in your own words. And when you paraphrase, what the best papers will do is they'll use a paraphrase that shows your understanding, right? That demonstrates you understand the portion of text you're talking about. And how do you do this? Well, one mistake students will make is they'll essentially take a statement by the author and maybe change a word or two, but it'll basically be the same, and just treat that as a paraphrase, right? So that's not what a paraphrase is. A paraphrase is when you take the idea being expressed, you put it in your own words, and you might even use your own examples to demonstrate you really understand it, right? So that's what the best papers are going to do. They're going to take the author's idea, put it in your own words, and show me, yeah, this person is really able to be familiar with these ideas because she can take this idea, add her own examples, explain it in a new way. That's what I'll be looking for when you paraphrase. Now, it's not like all paraphrases are like that. This one isn't, right? I just say, look, Socrates says the love of gods doesn't define piety, and that's fine. But the thing to keep in mind is, whenever you attribute a claim to an author, it needs to have this in-text citation. Okay. So I have Texas A&M San Antonio's statement on plagiarism. I'll just very briefly say I take plagiarism very seriously, and it is not hard to catch, and I do report those who engage in it. So please, 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 before you consider, and what plagiarism is any attempt to pass off the work of another as your own. So before you would consider doing that, please, if you are struggling with your paper, please contact me. I'm always willing to help. Visit the Writing Center. Plagiarism is a serious academic matter. It is something I take seriously and will report. And I also want to make a few comments just on appropriate sources to use. So I said the only source you have to use is the reading, but there are others that you can use. But here are sources you shouldn't use. Wikipedia, blogs or internet discussion forums, online notes posted by other professors. This one in particular can be a common one that leads to plagiarism. when you start using online class notes posted by other professors, it often leads to students taking those ideas directly, just putting them in their paper without attribution, and that is a recipe for plagiarism. If you are looking for, and the reason, again, the Wikipedia is not allowed is because in an academic context, we only want peer-reviewed materials. While Wikipedia is actually a great website, it just doesn't meet that standard. But if you are looking for a good online, if you want to find a source that will give you a little more explanation about any philosophical topic, I would recommend either the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy or the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. The Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy is a little more geared towards beginners, so that might be your first place to go, but I do recommend both of those. Okay, so what we have left in this document, again, I've already said all the bibliographic information is listed here for you to use. I've also got some examples in general of how to do other sorts of citations. And then we'll say a few things about grading. So the assignment is worth 50 points total. It's broken down these three categories: basic requirements 20, explanation section 15, analysis 15. So these 20 points for the basic requirements should be very easy. Did you submit the paper on time? Did you follow the prompt? Word length requirements, formatting. The biggest thing students miss on in basic requirements is not doing in-text citations, not doing direct quotations, not having a bibliography. If you can go through all these questions here and say yes, you should easily get those 20 points. Now, what I'll be looking for in the explanation analysis sections, really I've already explained that, so my comments above would more or less suffice. But each of those is worth 15, and you can see how the grading breaks down, right? So excellent would get 15, good, average, poor, and unacceptable would go down from there. And the one last thing I'll say about grading, right? So in terms of getting feedback on your paper, when you submit your paper through Blackboard, you will get a message after I've graded it saying what your grade is, your score out of 50, and then a short message saying to email me if you would like your comments. And so I encourage you, if you do want feedback on your paper, all you have to do is send me a quick email saying that you want the feedback. I'll write something up and I'll send it back to you. The only reason I do that is because I'm happy to give students feedback on their work. I think it's important, but it can be time consuming. So if a student is not going to look at it, I don't want to automatically give it to them for which it will not be useful to them. But as long as you send me a quick email, I'm happy to give you feedback back on your paper. Okay, I think that pretty much covers everything. We went over here's the response paper descriptions. The only last thing I'll say is, depending on when you're watching this video, this document might look a little different. For instance, you'll see response paper 3 and onward right now. The prompts are to be announced. I'm still working on those. So I would suggest always access this document online. Don't print it out or anything like that, because I will be making updates to it. Namely, I'll be adding the prompts for response paper 3 and 4 and 5, etc., etc. So just always access online. You can always find the latest version posted to Blackboard. Okay, so I think that's about it. If you have any questions about the response papers or anything else, please feel free to contact me. Thanks for watching, and I hope the video was useful.